A company cook is standing out in the biting cold morning air, just right outside an infirmary tent. His head is absolutely pounding, throat's on fire. He figures, it's just a fever, just some routine bug going around the military base, so he steps inside to report sick. The date on the calendar inside that cramped medical tent at Camp Funston, Kansas, is March 4th, 1918. The cook's name is Albert Gitchell. Now, he doesn't know it yet, but as he's breathing heavily into that tight space, he is literally firing the starting gun on a catastrophe that is going to completely swallow the globe. It was the Kansas spark. Gitchell's single, scratchy throat was the spark. And that military base, it was a massive powder keg of tightly packed human bodies. The sheer speed of what happened next, it completely defied all medical logic of the era. The exponential growth was just terrifying. Think about this. Gitchell walks in at dawn, right? By noon, literally just hours later, 107 soldiers had collapsed with the exact same symptoms. Fast forward just 1 week, 522 cases. Within a single month, 1,127 young, incredibly fit soldiers are bedridden, and 46 of them are dead. And yet history would quickly and totally unfairly mislabel this entire nightmare. The Spanish flu? That's what you've probably heard it called, right? But the name is a total lie. The virus almost certainly did not originate anywhere near Spain. So in the spring of 1918, World War I is still just tearing Europe apart. Britain, France, Germany, the US, they all clamped this strict, ironclad wartime censorship on their press. You absolutely could not print that your soldiers were dying of the flu instead of enemy bullets. It would totally crush morale. But Spain? Well, Spain was neutral. Their press wasn't censored. So when the Spanish king, Alfonso XIII, fell ill, their newspapers naturally just reported on it. Because Spain was literally the only country openly talking about the bodies piling up, the rest of the world just kind of pointed a finger and assumed, oh, it started there. The Spanish were furious, obviously. They actually, ironically enough, called it the French flu. The tiger awakens. As troops shipped out across the Atlantic on these crammed transport vessels, they carried that spring virus right along with them. But that first wave was relatively mild, basically just a bad seasonal flu. A lot of doctors just brushed it off. But then, the virus mutated. If that first wave was a harmless house cat, what returned to the shores of Boston in September of 1918 was a fully awakened tiger. At Camp Devens, just outside Boston, a doctor named Roy Grist watched completely helplessly as 75 men died every single day. He wrote this really chilling letter to a colleague. He said, "These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe and very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia. It is horrible." And it was. Autopsies showed lungs that were entirely liquefied. They literally looked like liver tissue. These patients were drowning in their own fluids. Their skin would turn this deep, bruising blue color from the lack of oxygen, a terrifying condition known as cyanosis. Now, here's where things get really bizarre. Normally, a seasonal flu takes out the very young and the very old. It creates this U-shaped mortality curve on a graph. But in 1918, a massive, terrifying spike emerged right dead in the middle, creating this completely unprecedented W-shaped mortality curve. A 25-year-old in absolute peak physical condition was significantly more likely to die than a frail 75-year-old. It was like the virus was actively hunting people in the prime of their lives. The reason why is this massive, lethal medical paradox that scientists didn't fully grasp for decades. The virus triggered what we now call a cytokine storm. Essentially, it weaponized youth. A young, really robust immune system would detect the virus and fight back so aggressively, so violently, that it ended up destroying the patient's own lung tissue in the crossfire. The stronger your immune system was, the faster it killed you. That is exactly why someone could feel perfectly fine eating breakfast and literally be dead by dinner. A tale of two cities, as this mutated super killer ripped across the American home front. The survival of entire populations suddenly hinged on these split-second, high-stakes decisions made by local officials. Let's look at Philadelphia. Despite glaring warnings of the virus at the nearby Navy Yard, the public health director told everyone, hey, don't worry about it, and allowed 200,000 people to cram shoulder to shoulder for a huge Liberty Loan Parade. Within 72 hours, every single hospital bed in the city was full. Within 6 weeks, 12,000 people were dead. They ran out of coffins. They literally had to bring in heavy industrial steam shovels just to gouge mass graves out of the earth. Now, meanwhile, St. Louis? 2 days after that parade, St. Louis looks over at the East Coast, panics and instantly slams their city shut. Schools, churches, theaters, boom, closed. Gatherings banned. Because of that immediate aggressive lockdown, the death rate in St. Louis was less than half of what happened in Philadelphia. But borders meant absolutely nothing to this pathogen. It was totally indiscriminate. In Samoa, 1 in every 5 people just dropped dead, a 22% mortality rate. In Alaska, entire Inuit villages were simply erased from the map. No survivors. None. In India, an estimated 18 million people perished. That's roughly 6% of the subcontinent's entire population, just gone in a matter of months. When you actually sit down and look at the sheer scale of the math here, it is paralyzing. World War I was the deadliest conflict in human history up to that exact moment, claiming about 17 million lives over 4 brutal years of trench warfare. The 1918 pandemic, it killed between 50 and 100 million people in roughly 2 years. Think about that. It slaughtered at least 3 times as many people as the entirety of the Great War. The Great Amnesia. Almost as quickly as it had arrived, the fire just sort of burned itself out. The virus mutated again into a much less lethal strain, the survivors developed herd immunity, and the death counts finally plummeted. But what happened next is honestly perhaps the most bizarre part of the entire catastrophe. The world simply decided to pretend it never happened. Historian Alfred Crosby later dubbed it America's forgotten pandemic. And it's true. There are practically no monuments dedicated to the victims. Almost no novels or contemporary films were made about it. It was completely overshadowed by the end of the war and the frenzied, wild dawn of the Roaring '20s. Because a virus has no villains to defeat, no physical front lines to cross, and no clear heroes to celebrate, society seemingly just agreed to this massive, collective, traumatic amnesia. 50 million ghosts just swept right under the rug of history. Which brings us right back to Albert Gitchell, that army cook shivering outside the tent in Kansas. He didn't die that morning in 1918. He actually survived his bout with the flu. He finished up his military service, moved back home, and lived a long, completely quiet life. He died as an old man in 1968, outliving his initial fever by exactly half a century, taking his last breath in a world that had completely erased the memory of the 50 million people who perished right behind him.